And this is AP Psychology, Chapter 18. Social psychology is what we'll be talking about today. Social psychology is a scientific study of how people think about, influence, and relate to one another. In thinking about others' behavior and its possible causes, we tend to underestimate the influence of the situation, thus committing the fundamental attribution error. Our attitudes predict behavior when our influences are minimized, when attitudes specifically relevant to the behavior, and when we are aware of our attitudes. Our actions can cause and modify our attitudes, especially when we feel responsible for those actions. Research on social influence indicates that when we are unsure about our judgments, we are likely to adjust them toward the group standard. Sometimes social influences are even strong enough to make people conform to falsehoods or capitulate to cruelty. The presence of others can arouse individuals, boosting their performance on easy tasks, but hindering it on difficult ones. When people pool their efforts toward a group goal, individuals may free ride on others' efforts. Sometimes groups' experiences arouse people to make them anonymous, and thus less self-aware and self-restrained. Within groups, discussion can enhance members' prevailing attitudes and produce groupthink. A minority committed to a position can, however, influence a majority. Prejudice still often arises from social inequalities, social divisions, and emotional scapegoating. Research shows that stereotypes are a byproduct of our natural ways of simplifying the world. Aggression is a product of nature-nurture. In addition to genetic, neural, and biochemical influence, aversive events heighten people's hostility. Aggressive behavior is a product of nature and nurture. In addition to genetic, neural, and biochemical influence, aversive events heighten people's hostility. Aggressive behavior is also learned through rewards and by observing role models in media violence. Conflicts are fueled by social traps, mirror image perceptions. Geographical proximity, physical attractiveness, and similarity of attitudes and interests influence our liking for one another. Passionate love is an aroused state where we cognitively label as love. Passionate love often emerges as a relationship emerges and is enhanced by equity and self-disclosure. The presence of others at an emergency can inhibit helping, and many factors also influence our willingness to aid someone in distress, including cost-benefit analysis and social norms or expectations. Enemies become friends when they work towards subordinate goals, communicate clearly, and reciprocate conciliatory gestures. Social psychology scientifically studies how we think about influence and relate to one another. Social thinking. Does absenteeism signify illness, laziness, stressful, or work atmosphere? Was the horror of 9/11 the work of crazed evil people or ordinary events corrupted by life events? Social thinking involves thinking about others, especially when they engage in doing things that are unexpected. Attribution theory states that we tend to give casual explanation, Attribution theory states that we tend to give a causal explanation for someone's behavior. We may explain people's behavior in terms of internal dispositions or traits or in terms of external situation. For example, a teacher may explain a child's hostility in terms of aggressive personality or as a reaction to stress or abuse. The fundamental attribution error is our tendency to underestimate the situational influences and to overestimate the dispositional influences, and can lead us to unwarranted conclusions about others' personality traits. For example, we blame the poor and the unemployed for their own misfortune. Attribution theory was created by Fritz Heider in 1958 and suggested that we have this tendency to give causal explanations for someone's behavior, often by crediting either the situation or the person's disposition. A teacher may wonder whether a child's hostility reflects the aggressive personality, that's his dispositional attribution, or the reaction to stress or abusive situational attribution. Dispositions are enduring personality traits. So if Joe is a quiet, shy, and introverted child, he is likely to be that in a number of situations. The tendency to overestimate the impact of personal dispositional and underestimate the impact of situations in analyzing the behaviors of others lead to the fundamental attribution error. We see Joe as a quiet, shy, introverted most of the time, but with friends, he's very talkative, loud, and extroverted. How we explain someone's behavior affects how we react to it. So we see the negative behavior of a person swerving on the road. We can either think of that as maybe there's something wrong with the driver, like they're ill, or it could be their disposition. The other driver is a crazy driver or a bad driver. Our tolerant reaction to the fact that we think that there's something wrong is we might proceed past them with a wide berth, maybe looking to see at the car to see if they need help. The unfavorable reaction would be to speed up and race past the other driver and giving them a dirty look. A belief and feeling that predisposes a person to respond in a particular way to objects, other people, and events is our attitude. If we believe a person is mean, we may feel dislike for the person and act in an unfriendly manner. So attitudes are feelings often based on our beliefs that predispose us to respond in a particular way to objects, people, and events. Our attitudes predict our behaviors imperfectly because other factors, including the external situation, also influence behavior. Democratic leaders supported Bush's attack on Iraq under public pressure. However, they had their private reservations. Attitudes can affect action. Not only do people stand for what they believe in, they start believing in what they stand for. Cooperative actions can lead to mutual liking in beliefs. Attitudes have a strong impact on actions. When outside influences on what we say and do are minimal, the attitude is specifically relevant to behavior. We are keenly aware of our attitudes. Philip Brickman studied models of helping and coping. Brickman and his colleagues have suggested that whether we help as well as how we help someone in need depend largely on our answers to two important questions: who is responsible for the problem and who is responsible for the solution. In Brickman's moral model, actors are held responsible for both problems and solutions. They are most in need of proper motivation. Traditionally, we have viewed criminality and alcoholism in this way. You got yourself into this mess, now get yourself out. Helpers simply exhort people to assume responsibility for their problems and to work their way out. In the compensatory model, people are not seen as responsible for problems, but they are responsible for solutions. Jesse Jackson once stated, "You are not responsible for being down, but you are responsible for getting up." People need the resources or opportunities that the helper may provide. Nonetheless, the responsibility for using this assistance rests with the recipient. In the medical model, people are seen as responsible for neither the problem nor the solution. Helpers say, "You are ill, I'll try to make you better." This approach, of course, characterizes the healthcare system in all modern societies. Helping involves providing treatment and care. In the Enlightenment model, actors are seen as responsible for problems, but as unable or unwilling to provide solutions. They are viewed as needing discipline. Helping means earning their trust and giving them guidance. Alcoholics Anonymous explicitly requires new recruits both to take responsibility for their past history of drinking, rather than blaming it on something or someone else, and to admit that it is beyond their power to control the drinking, without the help of God and the community of ex-alcoholics. Brickman suggests that each of these models has some deficiency in terms of effective helping and coping. For example, the potential deficiency of the moral model is that it can lead to adherents to hold victims of leukemia and rape responsible for their fate. Those advocating for the compensatory model may alienate the people they help. The recipients may come to see themselves as having to solve problems they did not create, thereby developing a rather negative, even paranoid view of the world. The deficiency of the medical model is that it fosters dependency, causing people to lose the ability to do something that they once did well. The possible drawback of the Enlightenment model is that it can lead to a fanatical or obsessive concern with certain problems and a reconstruction of a person's entire life around the behaviors or the relationships designed to help him or heal her deal with these problems. The small request and a large request. In the Korean War, Chinese communists solicited cooperation for U.S. Army prisoners by asking them to carry out small errands. By complying to small errands, they were likely to comply to larger ones. This is a condition known as the foot in door phenomena, the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request to comply late with a larger request later. And you'll see these all the time at the mall when they're offering you a small sample just to hook you into their sales pitch. The chameleon effect refers to our natural tendency to mimic others. Unconsciously mimicking others in expressions, postures, and voice tones helps us to empathize with others. Research participants in an experiment tend to rub their own face when Confederates rub their face. Similarly, the participants shake their own foot when they are with a foot-shaking person. The most empathetic people mimic and are liked the most. Role-playing affects our attitudes. Zimbardo assigned the roles of guards and prisoners to random students and developed role-appropriate attitudes. This experiment went awry, and Zimbardo has become an expert on this role-playing situation and in how it can cause people to behave in ways that are uncharacteristic. And in fact, he was used to testify at the Abu Ghraib trial when Americans abused Iraqi prisoners. Why do actions affect attitudes? One's explanation is that when our attitudes and actions are opposed, we experience tension, and this is called cognitive dissonance. To relieve ourselves of the tension, we bring our attitudes closer to our actions. The concept of cognitive dissonance is created by Fessinger in 1957. So cognitive dissonance works like this. If Fiona is complaining about how high her college tuition is, and she also is aware that her college needs money and able to operate, she becomes aware that her attitude and behavior are inconsistent And so she has to change to reach a point, and here she has decided that the school has a point. Social influence. The greatest contribution of social psychology is the study of attitudes, beliefs, decisions, and actions, and the way they are molded by social influence. And where we reach the ideas of conformity of obedience. Behavior is contagious, modeled by one, followed by another. We follow behavior and others conform. Others' behaviors may be an expression of compliance and obedience. So the chameleon effect is adjusting one's behavior and thinking to coincide with a group standard. In short, mimicry is part of empathy. The most empathetic people mimic and are liked the most. Rick Van Buren and his colleagues studied additional consequences of mimicry in an effort to learn more about its adaptive value. They wondered whether mimicry might foster pro-social behavior. In their initial experiment, they asked research participants to react to a series of specific advertisements that were part of an ongoing market study. During the test, the experimenter mimicked the posture of half the participants, copying their body orientation, leaning forward, the position of their arms, position of their legs. The experimenter did not mimic the other half of the participants. After leaving the room to retrieve materials for the next part of the study, the experimenter returned and upon passing the participant, accidentally dropped 6 pens that were on top of several papers. If the participants did not pick up the pens within 10 seconds, the experimenter picked them up herself. Results showed that the participants in the mimicry condition were significantly more likely to help picking up the pens. To determine whether mimicry leads to generally more pro-social orientation or whether it simply creates a special bond between the mimicker and the mimicked, Van Buren and his colleagues conducted a second study. The procedure was the same, except that the new experimenter entered the lab, presumably to administer the second part of the study. The first experimenter had already left the room when the second person arrived and proceeded to drop the pens. The mimic participants were again more helpful. This finding suggests that mimicry can produce a diffuse pro-social orientation that transfers to other people. In third study, researchers utilized a new dependent variable, monetary donations to Clinic Clowns, an organization that visited or entertained hospitalized children. Some research participants were mimicked, others were not. They were then ushered into another room by the same experimenter or by a new one. Explaining that the university was conducting research for Clinic Clowns, the experimenter asked the participants to complete a brief survey that included questions about the organization. Before leaving the room, she identified 2 padlock boxes for placement of the questionnaires and if the person chose a donation to Clinic Clowns. Earlier, the participants had been paid for participation in the study. Again, the results indicated that the mimic participants donated significantly more money in both the new and the same experimenter conditions. In summary, the studies indicate that mimicry increases pro-social behavior and that this is not limited to the mimicker. The researchers suggest that mimicry may have general adaptive value by strengthening social bonds. Suggestibility is a subtle type of conformity, adjusting our behavior or thinking towards some group or standard. And so what they did in this experiment was they would show subjects these lines, the standard line and comparison lines, and then have them, the students or the subjects, decide which line matched. An influence resulting from one's willingness to accept others' opinions about reality. And so the 3 studies, people would look at the lines, and the Two of these people would be Confederates of the experimenters, and they would agree that the wrong line matched, which would cause the subject to comply with their answer because one is made to feel incompetent or insecure. The group had at least 3 people. The group is unanimous, and one admires the group's status and attractiveness. One has no commitment to or response. The group observes one's behavior, and one's culture strongly encourages the social standard. So, conformity is adjusting one's behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard. Solomon Asch found that under certain conditions, people would conform to a group's judgment, even when it's clearly incorrect. Experiments indicate that conformity increases when we feel incompetent or insecure. We admire the group's status and attractiveness. We've made no prior commitment to a response or being observed by other group members. And we come from a culture that encourages respect for social standards, are in a group with at least 3 people, and who are unanimous in their judgment, and we will more than likely conform. We are sensitive to social norms, and so we sometimes conform to gain that social approval. This is known as normative social influence, and at other times we accept information about reality provided by the group. This is informational social influence. Barron and colleagues made students do an eyewitness identification test. If the task was easy, the lineup exposure 5 seconds, conformity was low in comparison to a difficult half-second exposure task. In the Milgram studies, the experiment ordered teachers to deliver shocks to the learner for wrong answers. Torn between obeying the experimenter and responding to the learner's pleas, the people usually chose to obey orders, even though it supposedly meant harming the learner. Obedience was the highest when person giving the orders was close at hand and was perceived to be a legitimate authority. When the authority figure was supported by a prestigious institution, when the victim was depersonalized or at a distance, and when there was no role models for deviance. So this is Milgram's study. What they did was they would have the learner, who was actually a Confederate, would be wired up, and they had this electronic box here, and these are the labels showing that how heavy the shocks were. This would be the subject of the experimenter, and he would be the one administering the shocks. The Confederate here had a pre-recorded tapes of him being shocked so that it would be consistent, and he was not actually shocked, but the subject was not aware of that. And then, of course, the experimenter was here observing his behavior. Milgram studies results. The percent of students who obeyed the experiment, we found that there was close to 65% would actually comply with giving the electric shocks to the XXX super danger zone. A third of the individuals in Milgram's study resisted the social coercion, however, and here's an example of this, that an unarmed individual can single-handedly challenge a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square. Lessons from the Conformity and Obedience study. In both Asch's and Milgram's studies, participants were pressured to follow their standards and be responsive to others. In Milgram's study, participants were torn between hearing the victim's pleas for help and the experimenter's orders. And as we saw from the chart, that 2/3 decided to follow the experimenter's orders. So how do groups affect our behavior? Social psychologists study various groups, one person affecting another, families, teams, and committees. The experiments demonstrate the social influence can be strong enough to make people conform to falsehood, capitulate to cruelty. The studies, because of their design, also illustrate how great evil sometimes grows out of people's compliance with lesser evils. Evil does not require monstrous characters, but ordinary people corrupted by an evil situation. By understanding the processes that shape our behavior, we may be less susceptible to external social pressures in real-life situations that lead us to violate our own internal standards. Experiments on social facilitation reveal the presence of observers can arouse individuals, boosting their performance on easy or well-learned tasks, but hindering it on difficult, newly learned ones. When people pool their efforts toward a group goal, social loafing may occur as individuals free ride on others' efforts. When a group experience arouses people, makes them anonymous, and they become less self-aware and self-restrained, a psychological state known as deindividuation. The loss of self-awareness and self-restraint in a group situations that foster arousal and anonymity is deindividuation, and in deindividuation is typically where you see these in riots and large crowd scenes where people will behave in a way that they would not normally behave. Group polarization enhances a group's prevailing attitudes through discussion. If a group is like-minded, discussion strengthens its prevailing opinions. Within groups, discussions among like-minded members often produce group polarization and enhancement of the group's prevailing tendencies. Group polarization can have beneficial results as when it reinforces the resolve of a self-help group, but it can also have dire consequences as it can strengthen a terrorist mentality. Sometimes group interaction distorts important decisions. In groupthink, the desire for harmony overrides a realistic appraisal of the alternatives. Groupthink is a mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in decision-making the group overrides realistic appraisal of alternatives. We saw groupthink take place during the attack on Pearl Harbor, in the Kennedy administration during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Watergate cover-up, the Chernobyl reactor accident, and in the deliberations for action during the Vietnam War in the Johnson administration. Individuals have power. The power of social influence is enormous, but it's also the power of the individual. Nonviolent fasts and appeals by Gandhi led to the independence of India from the British. A minority that consistently holds to its position can sway the majority. This is especially true if the minority's self-confidence stimulates others to consider why the minority reacts as it does. Even when the minority's influence is not yet visible, it may be convincing members of the majority to rethink their views. Social psychology teaches us how we relate to one another through prejudice, aggression, and conflict, to attraction and altruism and peacemaking. Prejudice is a mixture of beliefs, often overgeneralized, called stereotypes, emotions, hostility, envy, or fear, and predisposition to action to discriminate. Prejudice is a negative attitude. Discrimination is a negative behavior. Prejudice works at the conscious and more at the unconscious level Therefore, prejudice is more like a knee-jerk response than a conscious decision. Racial prejudice has declined significantly in the last half of the century. In 1942, fewer than a third of all whites supported school integration. Today, nearly everyone agrees that children of all races should attend the same school. In 1942, some Americans agreed there should be separate sections for Negroes on streetcars and buses. Today, the question seems odd. Still, it's clear that prejudice persists. For example, questions relating to intimate interracial context still reveal prejudice. In one survey, only 3% of whites said they wouldn't want their child to attend an integrated school, but 57% stated that they would be unhappy if they married a black person. Prejudice also finds expression in more subtle ways. Discriminatory behavior surfaces when it can hide behind the screen of some other motive. Moreover, automatic emotional reactions linger. You are likely to illustrate this more subtle prejudice by simply reading some of the questions from survey James Patterson and Peter Kim constructed to assess racism in America. So, these questions are: do you believe you could fall in love with a black person? How do you think your friends would react if you married a black person? If you learn after an accident that you have received blood transfusion from a black person, would that bother you? Do you believe that black persons are poor because they fail to take advantage of the opportunities open to them? You are walking down the street late at night, you see a black teenage boy on your side of the street, a white on the other side. Would you cross the street? Americans have taken enough blame for the plight of blacks. Is it time blacks took responsibility for their own fate? Do you agree with this statement? Do you believe that we as a nation should spend less time on the problems of blacks and more on the problems faced by all Americans? Do you think it was a mistake to honor Martin Luther King Jr. with a national holiday? And then finally, does it make you uneasy to see a black man walking hand in hand with a white woman? Patterson and Kim suggest that white Americans' answers to their survey reveal a new racism that is subtler and much more hypocritical than blatant prejudice of 50 years ago. Although there is less overt racism, they state that in the 90s, white Americans held blacks responsible for their current position in American society. We tried to help, whites say, but blacks wouldn't help themselves. It's a dramatic contrast to the attitudes in the 1960s when many whites from the president down maintained that black people were owed compensation for the centuries of oppression. From their interviews, Patterson and Kim report that a majority of whites believe that white America has taken enough blame for low economic status of blacks, and now it's up to the blacks to improve their lot. 2/3 now believe that a black person has the same chance of success as a white. Along similar lines, Irwin Katz and Glenn Haas have attempted to explain whites' conflicting racial attitudes in terms of two core value orientation: humanitarianism and egalitarianism, which includes the democratic ideals of equality, justice, and concern for others' well-being, and Protestant ethic, which emphasizes devotion to work, individual achievement, and discipline. Katz and Haas hypothesize that humanitarian egalitarianism likely strengthens a pro-black attitude, with the perception that black people having a history of exclusion from main society are disadvantaged. In contrast, the Protestant ethic strengthens an anti-black attitude with the view that blacks' problems reflect their own shortcomings. The researchers predicted the dual cognitive value-added structures would themselves, however, be independent. 4 scales of humanitarianism, egalitarianism, those who are unable to provide for their basic needs should be helped by others, and the Protestant ethic, people who fail at a job have usually not tried hard enough. The pro-black, blacks should have jobs that are available and then work their way up to better jobs, and the anti-black attitude, blacks who fail at their jobs have only themselves to blame, were devised and administered to white students at 8 colleges. As predicted, positive correlations were obtained between the HE and the PB and between the PE and the AB. All other correlations tended to be much lower. In a separate study, the investigators used a priming technique. Completing a particular scale makes the measured value or attitude salient to the test for causality. As predicted, priming a given value raised scores on the corresponding attitude, but not affect scores on the other attitude. Priming a single attitude influenced scores on corresponding value, but not on the other value. Overt prejudice, such as over the duration of time, many prejudices against interracial marriage, gender, and homosexuality in minorities have decreased. Americans today express much less racial and gender prejudice, but prejudice still exists. 9 out of 10 white respondents were slow when responding to words like peace or paradise when they saw a black individual photo compared to a white individual's photo. Overt prejudice, such as denying children of a particular racial group the opportunity to end school, is discrimination that explicitly, openly, or consciously expresses negative beliefs and emotions. Subtle prejudice, such as that reflected in people's facial muscles responses and the activation of their amygdala to viewing black and white faces, is an implicit, often unconscious expression of negative beliefs and emotions. Prejudice often arises as those who enjoy social and economic superiority attempt to justify the status quo. Through our social identities, we also associated ourselves with some groups and contrast ourselves with others, mentally drawing a circle that defines us. The in-group also excludes them, the out-group. Such group identification promote an in-group bias and disfavoring of one's own group, even creating a us-them distinction by the toss of the coin, and leads people to show an in-group bias. Most women still live in more poverty than men. About 100 million women are missing in the world. There is a preference for male children in China and India, and even with self-selected abortion is outlawed. Although prejudice prevails against women, more people feel positively towards women than men. Women rated the picture of a feminized higher for a matrimonial ad. So the feminized person was more desired. Why does prejudice arise? Social inequalities, social divisions, and emotional scapegoating. Prejudice develops when people have money, power, and prestige, and others do not. Social inequality increases prejudice. So, in-group, people with whom one shares a common identity, is the in-group. The out-group, those perceived as a different from one's in-group. In-group bias, the tendency to favor one's own group. Prejudice provides an outlet for anger and emotion by providing someone to blame. After 9/11, many people lashed out against innocent Arab Americans. Prejudice often arises as those who enjoy social and economic superiority attempt to justify the status quo. Through our social identities, we also associated ourselves with some groups and contrast ourselves with others, mentally drawing a circle that defines us, the in-group, also excludes them, the out-group. Such group identifications promote in-group bias that is favoring one's own group, even even creating an us-them distinction by a toss of the coin leads people to show an in-group bias. Facing the fear of death tends to heighten patriotism, producing loathing and aggression toward those who threatens one's worldview. The scapegoat theory suggests that prejudice offers an outlet of anger by providing someone to blame to boast our sense of status. It also helps to have others to denigrate. One way we simplify our world is to categorize people into groups, and by categorizing them, we use stereotypes. In vivid cases such as 9/11 attacks, terrorists can feed stereotypes or prejudice. Most terrorists are non-Muslim. The tendency of people to believe the world is just and people get what they deserve and deserve what they get is known as the just world phenomena. One way we simplify the world is to form categories. In categorizing, we often stereotype them. We also estimate the frequency of events by vivid cases, for example, that some come to mind more readily than less vivid events involving the same group. Third, impartial observers may blame victims by assuming the world is just and that people therefore get what they deserve and deserve what they get. It's called the just world phenomena. And finally, hindsight bias may contribute to the tendency to blame the victim. Roy and Judy Edelson identified 5 beliefs that propel the groups toward conflict. Of special interest is the parallels they found between individuals' core beliefs and group worldviews. The former emerge primarily from personal narratives within the circle of family and interpersonal relationships. The later involve collective narratives based on a broader cultural understandings of in-group, out-group relationships. Both are detrimental to relationships. Superiority. The first core belief revolves around a person's enduring conviction that he or she is better than other people in important ways. The belief leads to a sense of specialness and deservingness and entitlement. People who hold the belief lack the empathy and thus appreciation of others' viewpoints and experiences. The same understanding occurs at the group level. The collective worldview involves a shared conviction of moral superiority and special destiny, and a special chosenness. A prime example is Hitler's notion of the Aryans as a master race, deserving and destined to achieve their rightful rule over other peoples of the world. Injustice. The second core belief involves around the perceived injustice at the hands of specific others or by the world at large. The individual may identify as unfair that which is only unfortunate. It can lead him or her to engage in retaliatory acts. The injustice worldview reflects an in-group's conviction that it has significant and legitimate grievances against an out-group. Such assessments of injustice are particularly common across cultural divides in which groups of people may have different definitions of what constitutes justice and how it should be achieved. The overriding impetus to war over the past 2 centuries, note Edelson, have been over issues of justice rather than security or power. Vulnerability. The third central belief in predisposing a person to social conflict revolves around the individual's conviction that he or she is perpetually living in harm's way. Such vulnerability is associated with high levels of anxiety. Individuals may become overly vigilant, bracing themselves for failure, rejection, injury, or loss. At the group level, fears about the future may be the most common cause of ethnic conflicts and often may produce spiraling violence. Perception of threat leads to the hostility towards sources of the threat in heightened ethnocentrism and the tightening of group boundaries. The sense of vulnerability characterizes the world views of both Israelis and Palestinians, therefore they're thereby fueling the Middle East conflict. Distrust. The fourth important belief involves distrust. At the individual level, the core belief focuses on the presumed hostility and evil intent of others. Harm is perceived to be intentional or the result of extreme negligence. The predisposition to suspicion is sometimes transformed into outright paranoia accompanied by delusions of persecution. The collective mindset views the outgroup as a dishonest and untrustworthy. People display a bias toward explanations, toward interpreting others' behavior as hostile and malevolent, even when other explanations are available. Such beliefs can prepare groups for the worst. Intergroup relationships can remain. Such beliefs can prepare groups for the worst. Intergroup relationships can remain fragile even after a conflict is resolved if deep-seated suspicions remain. Helplessness. The fifth and final core belief is one of personal helplessness. Individuals may be convinced that even carefully planned and executed actions will fail to produce good outcomes. The belief tends to be self-perpetuating because it diminishes motivation. The helplessness worldview produces a collective mindset of powerlessness and dependency. The authors note that within authoritarian political systems, the efforts of selected groups to improve their circumstances may be met by aggressive retaliation, reinforcing the group's sense of powerlessness. When more advantaged groups see their outgroup members feel powerless, they may attempt to persuade them that they lack the capabilities necessary to contend for society's rewards. So, after hindsight bias is after learning an outcome, the tendency to believe that we could have predicted it beforehand may contribute to blaming the victim and forming a prejudice against them. Aggression can be any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. It may be done reactively out of hostility or proactively as calculated by a means to an end. Research shows that aggressive behavior emerges from the interaction of biology and experience. The biology of aggression. 3 biological influences on aggressive behavior are genetic influences, neural influences, and biochemical influences. Genetic influences have been bred for aggressiveness. Animals have been bred for aggressiveness for sport and at times for research. Twin studies show aggression may be genetic. In men, aggression is possibly linked to the Y chromosome. Neural influences. Some centers in the brain, especially the limbic system, the amygdala, and the frontal lobe, are intimately involved with aggression. In psychology, aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. This definition of aggression has a more precise meaning than it does in everyday usage when an assertive salesperson or a dentist who makes us wince with pain may be described as aggressive. On the other hand, psychology's definition recognizes a verbally assaultive person or one who spreads a vicious rumor as being aggressive. Biochemical influences of animals with diminished amounts of testosterone, castration, become docile if injected with testosterone. Aggression increases. Prenatal exposure to testosterone increases aggression in female hyenas. Biological influences on aggression operate at the genetic, neural, and biochemical levels. Animal and human brains have neural systems that, when stimulated, either inhibit or produce aggression. For example, the brain has a frontal lobe system inhibiting aggression that, if damaged or disconnected, makes aggression more likely. Finally, studies of the effect of hormones, testosterone, alcohol, and other substances in blood show the biochemical influences contribute to aggression. 4 psychological factors that influence aggressive behavior are dealing with aversive events, learning aggression is rewarding, observing models of aggression, and acquiring social scripts. Studies in which animals and humans experience unpleasant events reveal that those made miserable often make others miserable. A variety of aversive events, including physical pain, personal insults, evoke hostility. The frustration and aggression principle states that blocking of an attempt to reach some goal creates anger, which can generate aggression. Aversive stimuli are especially likely to trigger aggression, and those who have been reinforced for aggression in the past, people can learn aggression by observing models who act aggressively. For example, in the family or in the media, watching violence or sexual aggression on TV or film. Media depictions of violence also trigger aggression by providing social scripts, mental tapes for how to act and provided by our culture. One aggression replacement program has been successful in bringing down rearrests. Even environmental temperature can lead to aggressive acts. Murders and rapes increased with temperature in Houston. A principle in which the frustration caused by blocking of an attempt to achieve a desired goal creates anger, which can create aggression. Cultures that favor violence breed violence. Scotch-Irish settlers in the South had more violent tendencies than the Quaker Dutch counterparts of the Northeast of the U.S. Sexually coercive men are more promiscuous and hostile in their relationships with women. This coerciveness has increased due to television viewing of R and X-rated movies. The media portrays social scripts and generates mental tapes in the minds of viewers. When confronted with these new situations, individuals may rely on social scripts. If social scripts are violent in nature, people may act them out. The general consensus on violent video games is that to some extent they breed violence. Adolescents view the world as hostile when they get into arguments and receive bad grades after playing such games. Playing violent video games can heighten aggressive behavior by providing social scripts and opportunities to observe modeled aggression. Recent studies have found playing violent video games prime aggressive thoughts, heighten arousal and feelings of hostility, and increase aggression. The studies also disconfirm catharsis hypothesis that the idea that we feel better when we vent our emotions. Conflict is perceived as incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. A social trap is a situation in which conflicting parties, by each rationally pursuing their self-interest, become caught in mutually destructive behavior. Many real-life situations pit individual interest against communal well-being, producing conflict. A perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Social traps are situations which conflicting parties may be caught in mutually destructive behavior as they pursue their own goals, thus creating an outcome that no one wants. Helping people to agree on regulations to communicate better and to be more aware of responsibilities toward others fosters cooperation. The spiral of conflict also feeds and is fed by distorted mirror image perceptions in which each party views itself as moral and the other as unworthy and evil intentioned. People in conflict form diabolical images of the other. Now, 3 factors are known to influence our liking for one another. Geographical proximity is conducive to attraction, partly because of the mere exposure effect. Repeated exposure to novel stimuli enhances liking of them. Physical attractiveness influences social opportunities and the way one is perceived. We view attractive people as healthier, happier, and more sensitive and more successful. As acquaintanceship moves toward friendship, similarity of attitudes and interests greatly increase liking. The factors that foster attraction are explained by reward theory. We like those whose behavior is rewarding to us, and we will continue relationships that offer more rewards than costs. So proximity, the geographic nearness, is a powerful predictor of friendship. Repeated exposure to novel stimuli increases their attraction. This is the mere exposure effect. So if you want someone to like you, just be around them as much as possible. Physical attractiveness. Once proximity affords contact, the next most important thing in attraction is physical appearance. Similarity, similar views among individuals causes the bond of attraction to strengthen. So similarity breeds content. So the more like other people you are, the more likely it is you will like each other. Passionate love is an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another, usually present at the beginning of a love relationship. There's the two-factor theory of emotion is at play here. The physical arousal plus the cognitive appraisal of takes place. The arousal from any source can enhance one emotion depending on what we interpret or label the arousal. So we can view passionate love as an aroused state that we cognitively label as love. The strong affection of companionate love, which often emerges as a relationship matures, is enhanced by equity, a condition in which both parties perceive a proportion of what they give. Another vital ingredient of loving relationship is mutual self-disclosure, in which partners reveal each other intimate details about themselves. In companionate love, this deep affectionate attachment we feel for those whom our lives are intertwined. So as in the courtship phase, everybody's happy and smiling, and then you get into the marriage phase. Altruism is an unselfish regard for the welfare of others, and equity, a condition in which people receive and form relationships in proportion to what they give. And then you have self-disclosure, revealing intimate aspects of oneself to others. The importance of physical attractiveness is not limited to dating relationships. For example, college students judged an essay written by an attractive author to be of higher quality than one by an unattractive author. Similarly, simulated juries conferred less guilt and punishment on physically attractive defendants than on unattractive defendants. Ralph Keyes has found that the average salary of over 17,000 middle-aged men was positively related to their height. Every inch over 5'3" was worth an extra $370 a year. So it appears that if you walk tall, you'll carry a fatter wallet. Physical attractiveness stereotype. What is beautiful is good extends to adults, the evaluation of children. In one study, for example, over 400 fifth grade teachers evaluated attractive children as having greater intelligence, scholastic potential than unattractive children. And as early as nursery school, children themselves are responsive to the physical attractiveness of their peers. It has been suggested that parents may implicitly teach their peers. School children themselves are responsive to the physical attractiveness of their peers. It has been suggested that parents may implicitly teach the physically attractiveness stereotype through bedtime stories they read their children. Physical deformities and chronic illness often symbolize inner defects. The villain Peter Pan and Captain Hook wore a prosthesis. In Cinderella, the mean stepsisters were ugly. Hansel and Gretel were victims of the arthritic witch. Pinocchio's nose lengthened as his integrity slipped. Is it possible that more recent here? So, and what other examples could you think of? Could E.T., Alf and the Cookie Monster, who are scary yet lovable, still serve to weaken the physical attractiveness stereotype? Altruism is an unselfish regard for the welfare of others, donating blood, offering time and effort to help victims of natural disaster, risking one's life to save victims of genocide with no expectation of personal reward are examples of altruism. The bystander effect is the tendency of any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. The bystander effect is the tendency for any given bystander in an emergency to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. Research on the bystander effects indicates that to decide to help, one must notice the event, interpret it as an emergency, and then assume responsibility for helping. So this is how it works. First, you have to actually see the event take place. You have to interpret it as that it's an emergency. If you don't interpret it that way, you're not going to help. Then you have to assume responsibility. If you don't accept responsibility, then you won't help. If you do, you will. And so they've done a series of experiments with these using people laying on the sidewalk. And, the social exchange theory, our social behavior is an exchange process. The aim is to maximize benefits and minimize costs. Social exchange theory proposes that the underlying all behavior, including helping, is the desire to maximize our benefit, which may include our own good feelings and minimize our costs. For example, we will donate blood if we anticipate the rewards, social approval, good feelings for doing goods, etc., exceeds the cost, time, and discomfort. Social norms may also prescribe altruistic behavior. The reciprocity norm is the expectation people will help, not hurt those who have helped them. The social responsibility norm is the expectation that people will help those who are dependent on them. So here we have the reciprocity norm, the expectation that we should return help, not harm those who have helped us. Social responsibility norm, largely learned, it is a norm that tells us to help others when they need us, even though they may not repay us. Peacemaking. Subordinate goals are shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. Communication and understanding develop through talking to one another. Sometimes it's mediated by a third party. Research suggests that non-competitive contact between parties of equal status may help reduce prejudice. More important, the discovery of subordinate or shared goals that require cooperation can turn enemies into friends. Communication, sometimes through a third-party mediator, also promotes mutual understanding. Finally, the grit strategy suggests that reciprocated conciliatory gestures bring peace. Graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction is known as grit. This is a strategy designed to decrease international tensions. One side recognizes the mutual interests and initiates a small conciliatory act that opens a door for reciprocation by the other party. Lance Shortland wrote an interesting article in which he notes that observers sometimes do intervene. In fact, they may actually apprehend a criminal and mete out punishment. Note this came from the Washington Post. In fashion of Max Sennett comedy, 29 cab drivers from the L&M private car service and No Wait car service chased 3 men who had robbed and stolen one of No Wait's taxis. Alerted over the radio by their dispatcher, the cab drivers chased the suspects from 162nd Street and Amsterdam Avenue through 2 boroughs, finally cornering their prey in the Bronx. There they collared 2 of the suspects, beat them, and held them until police arrived. Both were admitted to Fordham Hospital. One of the drivers, a Vietnam veteran, said after the incident, "We've got to stick together." Shotland's review of the research suggests that it happens only in vigilantism only happens in response to certain types of crime under definable conditions. First, observers strongly identify with the victim, as is true with the taxi drivers, having a clear sense of their own vulnerability. Second, the crimes were especially threatening to the local community standards, and thus witnesses are strongly motivated to prevent recurrence. Third, bystanders are certain, although sometimes mistaken, about the nature of the crime and identity of the criminal. Finally, spontaneous vigilantism usually occurs in neighborhoods that are socially and ethnically homogeneous. Shotland also made the interesting observation that banding together allows the participants to share responsibility for an illegal behavior, whereas the presence of others usually fosters bystander inaction. In a vigilante group, it leads to action. Because the bystander inaction is more typical, many European countries have Good Samaritan laws that make it a crime not to summon aid or help someone in serious distress. These laws were in effect during the investigation of photographers at the scene of Princess Diana's car crash in August of 1997. In contrast, only a handful of states require people to help strangers in an emergency. Some legal experts suggest that the difference is due to the part of the cultural differences in values. Americans emphasize individualism, whereas Europeans focus on social solidarity. Vermont, Minnesota, and Wisconsin are among the states that have the strongest laws, but even these laws, narrowly written, are infrequently used, and when applied, carry light punishment for violation. For example, in Vermont, failure to help someone exposed to grave physical harm is punishable by a fine of up to $100. The Minnesota law makes it a petty misdemeanor to fail to help someone at the scene of an emergency who is exposed to or has suffered grave physical harm. Violation of Wisconsin's law carried one of the most severe penalties, up to 30 days in jail and a $500 fine. Shotland discusses some potential benefits of such legislation. It might reduce diffusion of responsibility by making bystanders realize that they will be held personally responsible for their inaction. Furthermore, it would give the tip and balance toward intervention if bystanders find the situation ambiguous. They might feel it safer to guard against the penalty by intervening rather than walking away. On the other side, Shotland notes that these benefits will come only if the duty to assist legislation can be strongly enforced, which may be difficult. Criminal activity is often surrounded by ambiguity. Should a witness be penalized for an innocent mistake? How can it be distinguished from deliberate shirking of civil duty? And the laws also have an implicit time frame within which the authority must be notified. In the famous case of Kitty Genovese, one person called the police after considerable soul searching. His response was too late. Should he have been prosecuted? Could it ever be determined without his cooperation how soon he knew of the attack? Is it possible that the witnesses may actually be discouraged from reporting information because of the fear of reprisal? All these things would have to be considered. And this is the kind of things that social psychology seeks to discover. So this concludes Chapter 18, Social Psychology. I hope you enjoyed it. this also would be the conclusion of our book, and we would begin studying for the exam. Thank you.